welcoming our next speaker, Dr. Janice Brahney. Dr. Brahney is an assistant professor at Utah State University. Janice holds a master's degree in earth science and a bachelor's degree in environmental science, both from Simon Fraser University in Canada. She received her PhD in environmental biogeochemistry from the University of Colorado Boulder. Her research sits at the nexus of several critical zone disciplines, and it includes three primary themes: the atmosphere as a vector for material transport to aquatic ecosystems, climate change effects in mountain environments, and the cause, effect, and mitigation of water quality impairment. Much of Dr. Brahney's work has produced results with far-reaching implications for policy, land use regulation, and ecosystem monitoring. Her work has been cited in the IPCC and has received considerable attention from the media, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Geographic, Scientific American, and NPR. Welcome, Dr. Brahney.
Hello, and thank you for coming to my talk. My name is Dr. Janice Brahney, and I'm an assistant professor at Utah State University, and I'm going to be talking about atmospheric plastic deposition. I'd like to start off by pointing out that less than a dozen papers have been published on this topic in the last couple of years, so we're still at the very early stages of understanding how plastic is emitted and transported through the environment. We also have almost no information on nanoplastics, which might have different emission points and transport pathways. So I'm primarily going to be speaking about this publication that came out in Science in June of 2020. We're all here because we have a global plastics problem. In the last 70 years, plastic production has increased substantively, and it's estimated that nearly 10 billion metric tons of plastic have been produced to date. And every single year we produce more and more plastic. It's estimated that 12 to 18% of the annual production ends up in the environment. Now, admittedly, these are very difficult estimates to make, but this could imply that nearly 1 billion metric tons of plastic waste are now in our ecosystems and in our environment. So as you know, plastics are made to be really durable. So they're made to resist all forms of natural decay. So instead of biodegrading in the environment, they will fragment into smaller and smaller pieces until finally they're small enough to be transported by the wind. And so this is where my research interests come into play. So I was really interested in trying to understand how much plastic is falling out of the atmosphere. Is it falling out with rain, or as we call wet fall, or is it falling out under dry conditions? Can we tell how far the plastic is traveling and what distance that plastic may have traveled before it arrived at our site? Can we determine what the major sources are? And here I'm distinguishing between the sources to the environment and the sources to the atmosphere, and it's likely that these are different. And then finally, what commodities are contributing to atmospheric plastics? So in order to answer these very big questions, I needed to collaborate with a network. So I collaborated with the National Atmospheric Deposition Program, and they monitor wet chemistry at over 300 sites around the country every single week. So this is a standard NADTV setup that you see on the left. And what was really critical to me was this wet and dry atmospheric sampler on this table here. So you can see that there's a bucket that is in this picture open to the atmosphere, and there's a sensor here that when it rains, it triggers that sensor, which moves the lid over onto the dry bucket. So the wet bucket can collect rain, and when it stops raining, there's a little heater on the sensor that will evaporate the water and it'll move the lid back over the rain bucket. So this allows for the collection of dry and wet fall independently of each other. Now I can't just take the dry bucket and see what's in it because it may not be representative of atmospheric deposition. If you have stuff that falls in the bucket and heavy winds come along, it's going to re-excavate the particles that are in that bucket and maybe only remove the really fine particles. It also means that there's a lot of potential contamination that can end up in the bucket. So I designed a very basic, simple sampler that can fit into that bucket. That has a glass plate where we could collect the microplastics, and it has 3 different screens that act as a wind baffle, so it prevents the wind from reaching that glass plate, but also prevents any sources of larger fragments of contamination that can enter our sample. So I carried out this study over a 14-month period at 11 different national park and wilderness sites in the western United States. I collected wet plastic deposition weekly and dry plastic deposition monthly. So what is dust normally composed of? So typically we would anticipate seeing soil dust. So we would see minerals and organic matter, which might be parts of bugs or fungal spores, maybe some pollen. But now we have to add plastic to our definition of dust. So I saw fibers, I saw particles, I saw microbeads and films. I saw microbeads in every color of the rainbow, variety of different particle types, and also fibers in every color of the rainbow. In order to generate data, I primarily used visual counting techniques. So I counted over 10,000 fibers and several thousand particles. For every fiber, I measured the length and the width, and for the particles, I measured the diameter. I also classified whether or not the microplastics were primary or secondary. So a primary microplastic is a piece of plastic that was created in that size. So like a microbead is a good example of a primary microplastic. A secondary microplastic is derived from the breakdown of larger commodities. And this allowed me to determine the deposition rate in terms of the number of plastics being deposited per meter squared per year or per day. But because I had the dimensions, I was also able to calculate the mass of plastic deposition per meter squared per year. In order to determine polymer composition, I collaborated with Thermo Fisher. I traveled to their site in California, and where we analyzed polymer composition using two different means. The first was to do individual fiber and particle identification. So as you can see here on the right, we have some beautiful spectra where we identified polyethylene and styrene. And it's a very painstaking process to try to pick these very tiny particles which might shatter or break apart or not survive the transition from the sample to the instrument. So this is a picture of a picked microbead. You can see the size of our tweezers, very, very fine point tweezers compared to the size of the microplastic. So you can see how challenging that is. The second method we used was the particle mapping method, and this was really critical for this particular research because it allowed us to identify what proportion of our sample was synthetic versus what proportion we might expect to see in dust like minerals or organic matter. So what did we find? Well, the majority of our synthetic plastics were fibers. In both the wet and dry deposition, we saw about 70% of what we identified were fibers. And this was very common types of materials. So we saw a lot of polyester, a lot of nylon. And I know we talk a lot about how technical gear and fleece can add a lot of synthetic microfibers to the environment, but polyester and nylon are also part of everyday clothing. In terms of the particles, about 30% of the particles were primary microbeads, or 10% of all the plastics we saw. So this is a pretty sizable fraction. And we don't think that these microbeads are coming from cosmetics because they tended to be really small. So these microbeads were between 10 and 30 microns in size, which is much smaller than what's typically added to cosmetics. We did identify some as acrylic, and we know that these microbeads in these size classes are often used in paints. So we think that one of the primary sources of these microbeads might be paints. So as I mentioned, I was really interested in understanding how the plastics were moving through the atmosphere, where the plastics might be coming from, what the major sources are to the atmosphere. And so I approached this using a couple of different techniques. And the first was using what are called back trajectory models. So these can determine the pathway that an air mass took during a period of time. So for example, on the left is representative of a sample that I took on June 25th, 2018, and the blue line represents the path the air took for the 48 hours before it arrived at my site. So I ran these models for every single day, for every single site that I was collecting data. And this allowed me to generate a lot of different statistics. For example, I could look at how many times that air mass intersected with a major urban center or city. I could calculate the total population that the air mass intersected with. I could look at the wind speeds or the total distance traveled. I also looked at other properties of the sample itself. So how much soil dust was associated with the plastic? Did we see an increase in plastic deposition with an increase in soil deposition, or the opposite? And what was that dust composed of? Was it mainly minerals? Did it have high organic matter? Were there any indicators of source like sodium and chloride, which might tell us it's coming from a marine source? And then finally, I was really interested in how broad-scale climate patterns can influence deposition. So I looked at things like the location of the jet stream, as well as different ocean climate proxies that influence air mass movement over North America, to see whether or not those features played a role in the deposition rate. And so what I found is that wet deposition and dry deposition look really different from each other. Wet deposition, so what fell out with rain, tended to be much larger in size. And so that tells us that it's coming from a nearer source. So we can hypothesize that it's coming from near local to regional sources. I saw a positive association with soil dust. So the more soil I saw in my sample, the more plastic I saw in my sample. So this can potentially be coming from any type of soil that are contaminated with plastic, which is probably any soil on the surface of the earth at this point. However, agricultural soils tend to have more plastic, and this is for two reasons. One is the addition of plastic mulch, and the second is the addition of biosolids derived from wastewater treatment plants. So wastewater treatment plants are really effective at retaining the microplastics in the solid fraction, which then gets converted into fertilizer. And about 50% of the biosolids produced in this country are applied to agricultural fields as fertilizers. So this is a potentially really significant pathway moving plastics into the environment, which can then be eroded by wind into the atmosphere. We also saw a really strong association with the number of cities or the total population that the air mass intersected with for wet deposition. So for example, on the left here is the week where we collected the highest plastic deposition rates. This was at Rocky Mountain National Park, which is fairly close to a major urban center. And as you can see that in this week, there were 4 different days where air masses passed through the Denver-Fort Collins area before arriving at our site. So during that week, we saw a plastic deposition rate of 300 plastics per meter squared per day. So what we think is happening is that as a storm front moves through an area, it generates a lot of wind, which has the potential to mobilize a lot of local to regional plastics and bring it up into the atmosphere, which can then get rained out. Dry deposition, on the other hand, looked very different than wet deposition. So first of all, it was much smaller in size, so this tells us that it's likely coming from much further away. We also saw a positive association with elevation, so the higher up a mountainside we were, the more plastic deposition we saw. And so this also tells us that it's potentially coming from farther away because it's moving higher up in the atmosphere. We also saw a negative association with dust. So the more dust we saw, the less plastic we saw in dry fallout, and vice versa. And then finally, we did see an association to the location of the jet stream and these major climate proxies. So if the jet stream was dipping really far south, as it is in this picture on the left, we saw greater plastic deposition rates. So all of these different data points are telling us that it's likely that dry deposition is derived from much further away. The plastics are moving high up in the atmosphere and are potentially moving really long distance, like cross continents. So in terms of the composition of dust and how much of our dust is composed of plastic, this particle mapping technique that we used helped us identify that between 2 and 6% of our samples were composed of plastic. Now this might sound like a really small amount, but if you think about the mass of material that is moving around the atmosphere, you will realize that this is really a substantial amount of plastic in our atmosphere. So at our 11 different national park and wilderness sites, we measured on average deposition rates that ranged from 48 to 435 plastics being deposited per meter squared per day. If we look at what that translates to for each of these different park areas, we estimated between 0.2 and 12 metric tons of plastic are being deposited to these protected areas every single year. And if we further extrapolate that to all Western protected areas, so that would be the green and the light green areas in the 11 Western states, that gave us an estimate for our visual counts between 1,000 and 2,500 tons per year. And then using our FTIR based estimates, we estimated between 1,000 and 4,000 tons per year. So the next really important question is, how are plastics ending up in the atmosphere to begin with? So we understand a lot of the different ways that plastic ends up in our environment, but how is it getting up into the atmosphere? Well, we think that marine sources might be really important. We know that the marine environment is polluted with a lot of plastics, and microplastics are often a lot less dense than water, so can be floating on the surface of the ocean. And a study that came out last year demonstrated how wave action and bubble burst action can mobilize these plastics up into the atmosphere in a very similar process to how sea salt aerosols are generated. In our study, we also found a positive relationship to sodium and chloride, which could also imply that the marine environment is contributing to our observed atmospheric microplastics. Another really important pathway or emission point is likely agricultural dust. So as I mentioned with wet deposition, which was primarily characterizing what is in the below cloud portion of the atmosphere, we saw this strong positive association with soil dust mass. So the more soil we saw in our sample, the more plastic we saw in our sample. So this could imply that agricultural soils are a really important source of microplastics to the atmosphere. And again, this can be because ag soils tend to have more microplastics than wildland soils. And finally, we think roads are really important. So a study came out last year that identified how roads might be really efficient at moving tire wear particles into the atmosphere. And we also think that this might be an important pathway for moving all kinds of different microplastics into the atmosphere, because road surfaces tend to be contaminated with a variety of different microplastics from many different commodity sources. And cars driving on roads provides this mechanical energy that can emit those plastics high into the atmosphere, where they can then be transported long distance. So you can see in this image here, which is a car driving on a dirt road, how high the dirt particles are being emitted up into the atmosphere. So what does this mean? What are some of the implications of plastics being absolutely everywhere? Well, the science to date does not suggest that this is an innocuous problem. As we've seen from many larger organisms, as they ingest plastic, it can lead to intestinal blockages, so it can lead to mechanical problems in organisms. It can also transfer contaminants into those organisms, which can lead to altered behavior and even death. And this has been observed for aquatic species as well as terrestrial species. In terms of what it might mean for soil and plant health, again, the signs are not very good. A study that came out last year looked at how microplastics concentration in soils influences plant yields and plant height. So as you can see on the left, as microplastics increased along the x-axis, that you saw a decrease in the yield of cotton and a decrease in the plant height. And of course, plant health is intimately tied to water and nutrients within the soil. So they also looked at the soil properties and found that as plastic concentrations increased, the amount of water that could enter the soil decreased, and also the amount of nutrients that were available to the plants decreased. So Olsen P, P stands for phosphorus, and that is a measure of the bioavailable portion of phosphorus within soils. And another study also examined how plastics in the soils might influence the microbial community composition, and did see a reduction in the enzymes that are being produced. And those enzymes are largely responsible for breaking down the organic matter and making those nutrients available for plants to grow. And then alarmingly, another study found that microplastics have the potential to be transported through the vascular system of plants. And the study that was published was not conducted in natural environment. This was a very controlled experiment, but it did demonstrate the potential, and so that's very concerning. Thank you for your time, and I will take any questions.